Good evening, this is the Oscar expert here with Brother Bro, and it's time to review Empire of Light. This is directed by Sam Mendes, and it follows Olivia Colman's character who works at a movie theater in the 80s. She's a little lonely, but then she finds friendship and, maybe even a little more than friendship with another new employee in the theater played by Michael Ward. And they bond, and they share problems, and they like the escape of movies. To be honest, I was a little bit bored during this film, and not everybody I talked to feels the same way. But there was a good chunk where I was kind of figuring out, why am I really supposed to care about what's going on here? I know what the purpose of the movie is. It's interesting because I think the story is almost serving a message that Sam Mendes wants to deliver about movies themselves. And, that's supposed to tie into life itself. I feel like he probably started with this sort of thesis on movies, and then he worked from there. But it really does feel like, when you think about it, that the stories are servicing this thesis to a point that they feel a little bit superficial. There's a good chunk of this movie that's about Olivia Colman's mental illness, and there's a good chunk of this movie that's about Michael Ward dealing with racism in the 80s. And then to tie these two together, there's this sort of romance or friendship that's happening, in a world where she's sort of lonely. And because I feel like these two things, mental illness and race, are kind of playing just to serve the message, and they kind of represent the same thing in the bigger picture, they kind of feel like superficial portrayals of both, and the movie doesn't even seem to be intending to tackle them at a deep level. And I hate to say it, but it almost feels too easy to accuse this movie of being shameless Oscar bait when you're trying to deal with a bunch of serious things and then also be about movies. I'm not saying this is where Sam Mendes is coming from, but that is kind of how it came across to me. Yeah, I think overall this movie is just very broad. The movie's trying to be about the things that help us escape the bad things, and you could have spun a wheel on the wheel of misfortune for what to give to each character, and Olivia Colman just happened to get, schizophrenia, and Michael Ward happened to get racism. But you could have any other misfortune on this wheel and it would have fed into the same exact message. That's where I think maybe he picked race because it feels important, and then maybe awards voters would go, wow, this is important. I don't want to make that uncharitable of an interpretation of what Sam Mendes is doing here, but again, too easy to pin that on the movie. I did mostly like the movie because, it's very well made. That's what we can expect from Sam Mendes. Good cinematography from Deakins, a nice score from Reznor and Ross, and ultimately, when you have Olivia Colman leading the movie, I'm invested enough because Olivia Colman brings a lot to every scene because she's just an amazing actress. I liked Michael Ward as well, and I did like their romance. I did like watching them build a chemistry, and by the end, I did feel for this relationship. So overall, I liked the movie, but it also wasn't a huge gut puncher, the most impactful movie I'm gonna see this year. As far as the romance goes, I did like that the movie's about a friendship. I'm always down for that. I always want to see two characters, discovering something with one another. And again, I know what they're supposed to discover with one another in this film, but I also didn't see specifically why they're drawn to each other, especially why Michael Ward would be drawn to this woman. That was a little bit perplexing to me. And then they just have a general friendship that helps them, alleviate the stresses of life. Yeah. I did understand more on Olivia Colman's side. She is lonely and she maybe has this desire to feel young again, and he helps her feel young again. I think that came across pretty well. But I do think Michael Ward's character and just in general has less depth than Olivia Colman's character. Olivia Colman dealing with a mental illness thing is at least an internal thing to deal with, and most of Michael Ward's problems are, racism is an external thing to deal with. I still don't feel like I know that much of who he is inside. Now that I've spouted my criticisms, I will say I do like the message of this film. I also think it was saying something about how we're kind of helpless when it comes to fixing other people's problems, which I think that's pretty true. Olivia Colman, like you said, I think she's great in this movie. She can really let you onto a deeper sadness that's lurking beneath the surface of this character, whenever she wants to. Michael Ward is great here, and I hope to see him in more roles. And there's a supporting performance by Toby Jones that, if you're a fan of his work, I think you'll really like this. Yeah, it's a little light on screen time, but he's got a couple moments that are really great. Colin Firth is pretty funny in this. It's not the kind of role that he's going to get Oscar consideration for, but it was good to see him in here. Cinematography-wise, it was well shot. but it wasn't one of Deacon's best films to me. I maybe wasn't as enchanted with the cinematography as others were. I think towards the end, when they start changing up some locations, there are some really beautiful shots, and you can feel like Deakins' work coming through a little more, especially like the end scene, for example. I thought how the movie theater was lit looked really beautiful though, and there was like a purpose to that. I think it was really strong work overall from him. And the score from Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross is definitely a standout. Although I do think it was a little overbearing and cacophonous in one particular scene. You know, again, like I wouldn't call it their best work, but these were things that were very strong throughout. Definitely a well-made film. It's no 1917 where Sam Mendes is doing a lot of like filmmaking trickery or trying to pull off something really ambitious and huge with how he's shooting it. It's more straightforward, I would say. I also thought there were some good moments of levity and humor in the movie. When you kind of sit on the story, though, it really isn't the strongest that we've seen from Sam Mendes. And I guess we'll get into awards, because I do think that this is the kind of movie that maybe could stay in Best Picture despite some mixed reviews, but
A lot of mixed reviews.
Honestly,
a lot of mixed reviews.
The reviews have been very mixed. Like, I don't know if it's the kind of movie that stays in Best Picture while rotten on Rotten Tomatoes and in the yellow on Metacritic. Like, people don't really like it that much, and I kind of get it, because the movie, as Oscar-y as it is, doesn't have that many like super strong gut punch moments that are just gonna sell awards voters in an instant.
I think it does have one at the end though. Like if you're invested in the movie, then you're gonna think that moment is like, wow.
Pretty much everybody I talk to is like, yeah, it was all right.
And even people who like it, they can acknowledge the criticisms levied against it.
I had the feeling leaving the movie that maybe this wouldn't cut Best Picture, but it could be the kind of thing like Being the Ricardos that is like really close or lurking. And even Letterboxd like doesn't like this movie that much. It's got like a 3.1. It's kind of on the cusp, but you got a couple nominations in there that I think are going to happen no matter what. Olivia Colman, an actress, is pretty easy. And then there's the cinematography from Deakins. I mean, that's pretty easy. And then the score from Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross. A lot of people really like the score. I think it's a nice score that could also just happen. And these three could happen without the movie. I don't think there's anything else that I'd be considering too much, like production design, maybe. Michael Ward could maybe get away in like supporting, but again, I don't think they explored his character like well enough. And I don't think that even if this was in picture, it would be contending an original screenplay or director. I would give this movie a 7 out of 10.
I give this movie a 5 out of 10.
This is weird because we kind of agreed on everything.
You know, I was just kind of bored. That's why it's 5 for me. I was like, this is fine. This is okay. Like the whole time.
Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing.
Are you a sucker for movies about the magic of movies?